Kelley Taksier. I'm a doctoral student in special education at the University of Florida. I'm here today with Dr. Cristina Santamaría Graff on behalf of the Council for Exceptional Children's Teacher Education Division Diversity Caucus. Dr. Santamaría Graff is the Interim Assistant Dean of Student Support and Diversity and an Associate Professor of Special Education and Urban Teacher Education at Indiana University Purdue University in Indianapolis. She has expertise in bilingual and multicultural special education and applies her skills in working with families of color, specifically Latinx immigrant families of children with disabilities. Taking a family as faculty approach, her practice-oriented research focuses on the ways community-engaged partnerships with families and other stakeholders can transform inequitable practices impacting youth with disabilities at the intersections of race, language, and other identity markers of difference. Her scholarship has been nationally recognized through the Ernest A. Linton Scholarship of Engagement Award and the American Educational Research Association's Award for Exemplary Contributions to Practice-Engaged Research. She is one of the editors for the journal Multiple Voices, the former American Educational Research Association Special Interest Group Program Chair for Spirituality in Education, and served 6 years as a board member of the Indiana Resource Center for Families with Special Needs. As these highlights suggest, Dr. Santamaría Graff's accomplishments are many. However, in the interest of honoring her time, we'll begin our discussion. First up, and this is off script, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastically. And I say that within the context of knowing that that's a loaded question for a lot of us right now. When you ask someone how someone's doing, we have to take into context kind of what's happening in the world and how we're situated within that. So I always tell people that in the moment, yes, right, like there's so much to be grateful for. There's so much, to look around and just surrounded by blessings, with my family, with the work that I do. And at the same time, really acknowledging the hardship of a lot of people in the world right now, particularly what's happening globally with a lot of crisis and conflict, as well as we're still in a pandemic, we're kind of coming out of it maybe, and we're also confronted with new realities that we are reckoning with as educators. So I appreciate the question, and I always have to answer it in that way because we are human beings navigating a really interesting time right now. So.
Well, I appreciate that too, because I always want to be honest, but then when I'm asked that question myself, I'm like, how much information do you want? So with that, we'll proceed. So the first official question is now to tell us in your own words, your role at your institution and your scholarly interests.
Thank you so much, Kelley. Well, my role right now is I'm actually serving as the Interim Assistant Dean of Student Support and Diversity, specifically looking at retention for BIPOC students, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, are students who have been historically minoritized and marginalized within educational settings and within higher ed institutions. So looking at pipelines of support to really create infrastructures that will bring them not only in through recruitment measures, but really support them through to graduation, completion, and getting really jobs that are meaningful and authentic to who they are. And I'm always looking at our teachers. I work specifically also as an associate professor of special education in our urban teacher education program. So part of that retention process is ensuring that our teachers are well prepared for the profession. And what that means today is something I'll probably weave into my answers, but there are so many complexities and so many things to consider as we are preparing our teachers, particularly to work with our BIPOC student populations with and without disabilities. And in terms of my scholarly interests, right now, I always have so many things that I'm interested in. I'm always trying to be the learner in all the spaces I'm in. One of the areas I feel very honored by, though, is the work that I do with families and have been doing with families for quite a long time. But in higher education for over a decade now, I've been able to work with families and learn from families. And I'll talk a little bit about my work with family as faculty, which is a model or an approach that I use to integrate families into the work that I do. However, in terms of my interests, some of my deepest interests lie in listening to what the families have to share with me, not only their assets and their ways of knowing and being, but the wisdom that they bring to the table as we begin to learn with and from each other. And so I can integrate their perspectives more authentically into my research, into my teaching, and how I kind of interact with principals and teachers at schools and in all the spaces that I'm actively involved in. And I could speak more about that, but I know for the sake of time, I'll let you run the show, Kelley, but you can just let me know too if I need to transition, but I'm happy to speak more to that as well.
I'm sure it'll come up again because I know families are central to your work within the framework of diversity. So I know it's going to come up again. So speaking of which, how does your research integrate and address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And are there particular frameworks or research methods that are particularly key in addressing these issues in your work?
Yeah, I was really thinking about that question, and what you're going to find, Kelley, and those who are listening, is it's very hard for me to answer a question just in like in a sound bite, for example, because I think really deeply about what it means, the cultural historical implications of the questions that I'm given. And I think that's also part of what I am trying to do as a teacher educator, to have our pre-service teachers really think deeply about what they're being asked to do and the language that they use to convey meaning. So these terms, DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, how does my research integrate that? The first thing I want to say is, how do we understand and frame these terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion? And where my work has led is that I don't use these terms without looking at the worldview context in which I'm situating that language. So for example, I recognize that we live we're living in a worldview, for example, or we're seeing things through a worldview that is rooted in dominant white culture, and that has implications for folks who are deemed different in any way, in terms of how they self-identify, their cultural backgrounds, their knowledges. So this term diversity is actually, and I am answering the question because this is very much a part of the research I'm doing right now, is really interrogating these terms, because the term diversity on one level can mean levels of or different cultures and different folks that show up at schools, students, their families. But what does that really mean when we talk about that? We are situating that within a dominant culture worldview. So difference or diversity is usually seen through a lens of, these folks are different from quote unquote white culture, so that positions them differently. And so even the term diversity can be, it's something to question and to think about before we throw out the terms. Equity too, equity for whom and what does that mean? So equity, would people of color, would BIPOC students and their families, would this even be a question if they weren't treated fairly and in all situations at schools, and if their voices were heard in all spaces? And so we have to, again, ask that question, particularly in light of students who come to the table with very multiple identity markers, including disability, and who are not seen as being part of the dominant culture because of a difference that maybe to them isn't so different. It's just who they are and how they see and operate in the world. And of course, inclusion is something that I think about very, very deeply in regards to, as a special educator, because that's part of my upbringing. I was a special educator for many years, thinking strictly about inclusion from a special ed point of view. You're thinking about free appropriate public education, you're thinking about least restrictive environments, you're thinking about all the ways that a student with disabilities is integrated into the general ed curriculum for most of the day with their gen ed peers and all of those things. And at the same time, that's also kind of one viewpoint. It can be expanded and really begin interrogating systemic oppressions that do not allow for all students to have the same access to resources and to curriculum and to instruction that others might. And again, we have to think about what is the dominant culture that we're operating under, that our schools are rooted in, that that might provide or might make certain groups of students feel excluded, not included in different settings. And so some of what I'm describing right now are integrated into frameworks that I use. I have recently, and I can speak to family as faculty. In my work with family as faculty, I have expanded upon that model. I did not come up with that model. I did not coin it. It is rooted in it came from a healthcare model that has been around for decades, and it has been adapted for teacher preparation programs, specifically special education. And within that context, though, what I found was some of the things I'm talking about around diversity, equity, and inclusion were not fully interrogated within that framework. So I felt I needed to expand upon it to include some of these understandings. So I have I'm creating what I call a developing theoretical framework around 3 essential understandings that include families are experts of their children. So no question, like that shouldn't even be a question. They are knowledge makers and they are contributors to their child's overall educational well-being and really should be situated that way. And under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the spirit of that, if you read it very closely, different sections talk about how parents and family members, and I want that to be an inclusive term, family, to mean multi-generational, to mean foster care parents, to mean grandmothers and grandfathers, and all the people that come together to raise a child, right? The community. But family in this case, their wisdom, their epistemic wisdom and their knowledge that they bring to the table really should be a part of those conversations that impact the trajectory of a student's life and academic well-being and overall well-being. Also, we need to examine another thing when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. How are we examining our own positionality, which is how we self-identify. I myself self-identify as a bilingual Mexicana. My father is Mexican. He's a Mexican immigrant. My mother is Italian Irish. I'm bi-ethnic, biracial, however you want to view those terms, but I do have, I'm situated very uniquely with my own positionality, and I recognize that has an impact in every space that I'm in. Also, my educational status in my work has an impact when I'm working with families. And if I don't recognize the power and authority that I bring to the table just by stepping into a room and how that changes dynamics, whether I want those dynamics to change or not, just by my presence and having that title can shift dynamics. And that's not necessarily a good thing all the time in my case, when I'm trying to think about my work through an equitable stance. I want everyone to feel and know that they have voice and they're contributing to the process. And something like power can shift that those dynamics, which is why the third essential understanding that I integrate into my research is analyzing power relations and who we are and what we bring to the table, and within the context that we're operating in, whether it's a school or university setting, wherever, or in the community, is going to also need to be interrogated, because families, in my case, don't always feel comfortable coming to the university. They don't feel like they're on their turf. And so turfism, as Martha Blue Banning, she out of the Beach Center in Kansas, talks about, she taught me through my reading of her work that turfism is real. And so many ways that I think about, creating power relations that are more even, maybe not fully, but more even, are by essentially holding some of my classes where I integrate family as faculty, not on university turf, but on turf that is more neutral, that families feel is more of their home. So I shift the turf to a nonprofit organization that is more like a parent center or a parent advocacy center, which is a space where they feel that they can own more, in terms of their own positionalities. And so I think I'll stop there. I did speak a lot about the ways that I'm integrating DEI into my work, but I'm happy to elaborate in other sections too.
Thank you. And I feel like what you're speaking to with turfism was something I really had to confront with the COVID pandemic, kind of restructuring my own teaching. I was suddenly, broadcast into families' homes, and I was even in some cases doing lessons at their homes. And that really, I think, allowed me to really recognize that I was on their turf, and how I interacted with them really had to respect that. So just a little aside there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really excellent and important point. And that needs to be written about, like, from your perspective, that would be actually something that would be very that I think we are all reckoning with as educators, how we're entering these private spaces, these sacred spaces that families, the home, right? The home. But you and I can talk about that later. But I think you bring up an excellent point. I just want to acknowledge what you're bringing to the table here too.
Oh, thank you for, just inspiring these connections. So with what you've just said, I think we're going to kind of edit the script a little bit. So instead of how does your teacher education pedagogy address DEI, how about how does family as faculty inform your teacher education pedagogy?
It very much informs it. So I have to give a little bit of context. I didn't just start doing family as faculty, that wasn't, I didn't just come across that model and start implementing it. It took, a whole decade before that. Like, I was a bilingual special education teacher, a bilingual education teacher. I did my student teaching in Mexico through a BCLAD program out of California through the Cal State system. And so I lived in Mexico for, about 14 months. And I was able to do my student teaching in Mexico City and in a small town called Choquén in near Cancun. But that said, those experiences led me to understanding how valuable and important families' epistemologies, their ways of knowing, are in shaping how we wrap around, not only we talk about wraparound services and special ed, but another layer to that is wraparounding supportive infrastructures, emotional support, psychological support, physical supports, like all these different ways of integrating the family into that support system with with educational structures. And I started to see that in Mexico. And, every system has their pros and they have things that they can improve upon. But one thing I loved about my student teaching experience in Mexico was that families during recess and lunch and during the year there would be involved in so many events very organically and naturally. Like now I'm going to complicate that by saying we're talking about a different educational system. And so there are differences in terms of how the relationship between families and teachers, and there's a whole history there. But what I want to pull out of my experience there that I think we could learn from here in the United States are that when I was student teaching there, it would be when there were events on campus, on the school campus, or not even like official events. Like here in the United States, we have these official events and then families are invited. There, it was more of a organic kind of relationship where grandmothers, uncles, aunts, cousins would kind of come onto campus at different times, not necessarily just for formal events, but as part of the fabric of the school and the school community. And I was really touched and moved by that, and how I got to know families, this capital F idea of families, big family, big community, through the networks that were connected to the school, like the school as a central hub of social interaction, of integrated events, of really honoring, in Mexico, they celebrate Children's Day, and that's a huge day, and all the families come and they put on plays and they have music, and, it's just packed, you're just packed, and to actually feel that and to know that that is alive and dynamic and evolving, and it demonstrates the expansiveness of the family. Like I wanted to, if I could put that in a bottle and bring it here to the States, I would. And I think we can do that. It's just that we have a different understanding of relationships too, in our system, and what school is and what home is, and kind of some of these separations. And family as faculty, for me, at least how I viewed it, was a way to create some of that community, capital C community, through the fabric of the choices that we can make as educators to welcome. And when I say welcome, I mean not just verbiage. Welcoming entails action. It entails feeling behind action, which is truly inclusive practices where you are genuinely wanting and happy to bring families and community onto school spaces and to really integrate them into all aspects of schooling, which for family as faculty and within a higher ed context means that the families that I work with are co-researchers, they're co-educators. And I have defined that in some of the work that I've written about, but essentially what that means is that I see them as leaders that we need to learn from, and we need to integrate their understandings into the fabric of our curriculum, of our instruction, of the activities that we are presenting to our pre-service teachers. And so much of my teaching in the work of family as faculty is ensuring that that syllabus is presented to families, and it's kind of like a blank IEP, like there's, the structure of the IEP, but it's not going to, it's a metaphor of not going to a family member and saying, here's the IEP already filled out, now sign on the line. It's a collaborative process. So I take the syllabus to the families, and it's very bare bones. I have the CEC standards there, but that's about it. And then we co-construct what is it that our pre-service teachers need to know based on, in alignment with these CEC standards and what I need to teach. But how do you conceive of this course? What would be the orientation through which, the pathways through which we are informing teachers about family epistemic wisdom and knowledge of their children, their expertise. And I want to just say really conscientiously that I'm very careful with also who I bring into those spaces, which families. I wish I could just open the door and say all families can be in this space and working with pre-service teachers. But we also have to realize that our human family, all of us, we all carry implicit biases. We all carry ways of thinking. And so I also have to really listen to the families that that I bring on or that I meet that can be potentially part of these projects, to ensure that maybe they're not carrying implicit biases about different other cultures or other human beings, or even about disability, or even about ways to think about the world, their worldview. I need that to be in alignment with how I was discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ensure that that's where they're kind of coming from. And if we're all on a continuum of learning, and so if they are in a space where their orientation is on a continuum of learning, where they are able to really demonstrate that they have an open mind for inclusiveness and diversity and equity, then they are really wonderfully positioned to be the co-educators and co-instructors and co-researchers in these courses. But I want to state that caveat, because it's something that I need to write about in this work, because we also have to be vigilant that the ideologies that we're presenting to our teacher educators are rooted in anti-racism, anti-ableism, and ways of knowing that are going to uphold and uplift BIPOC families. And so I think that's kind of the core of some of what I do.
Thank you. And I look forward to that forthcoming publication. I appreciate all the detail that already goes into a lot of your work, because I feel like a lot of times I'll read a study and like, that sounds great, but how can I do that? And I really appreciate that you give very actionable steps for how a model can be transplanted or applied in other contexts. And so thank you very much for that. So kind of playing off of that, so we know that training teachers to respond to DEI issues, or to even, I guess, understand them in the way that you presented them, is challenging. So what challenges have you faced and how have you overcome them? And in other words, are there keys to success that you would share with junior scholars like myself who are interested in supporting pre-service teachers in really understanding these issues and integrating them in their work as educators?
I love that question. And I'm going to be honest, it's something that I wrestle with all the time. And it drives me to continually think about how I can do a better job of creating environments that are going to kind of like universal design for learning. How can I create an environment that bends to meet where people are, rather than trying to impose a structure onto people to get them to think, to change, or to begin to think about systemic or social change. One of the areas that I think is extremely important for emergent scholars, for future teachers, for any educator right now, is that if we are going to do, DEI work, which shouldn't necessarily be conflated with anti-racist work or anti-ableist work, but, they are definitely partners. What I would say is a lot of the work begins with us. If we want to see the change out there on the outside in the world, then we need to do the inner work. And the inner work is really, really humbling if we do it with an honest heart and an open mind. And part of who I bring in as my teachers for this and is the work by Orlando Falsborda and Paulo Freire and Eve Tuck. I bring a lot of folks who have done participatory action research, including Michelle Fine, into my space. I like literally visualize them. Like, what would they tell me right now? Like, please give me some nuggets of wisdom here because I'm struggling. But critical consciousness is, it's a term that's getting used a lot. But if you really embody that, it is the deepest work of recognizing that we are operating in a dominant culture worldview that has been structured, systemically structured and positioned, or it has positioned, it's structured and it positions people who are different as other. Once we really understand that the system that we live in and operate in, and I mean not just educational systems, but the world system, the global system, has really been a project in colonization and a project in power over certain peoples for the benefit of a few. Once we begin to really embody that that is what this system has done, and that's why we're having these questions of why we have to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in all spaces, then we can begin to operate like our thoughts, our words, and our actions can begin to be we can become very self-aware of if we are aligning our truth to that, not to that worldview, but countering that worldview. If we don't want to operate in a world that operates through this power over mentality, then what are we doing to change that in our everyday moments? So we could be learning about diversity. We can be learning about these terms and think that, oh yeah, we're really aware of all this. We know what we're doing. We're in tune to what's going on, right? And then in a moment, you're on the road and you get frustrated, and then you yell out a racist slur or you yell out an ableist slur to a driver next to you. And so part of this work is recognizing that this work extends way far beyond the classroom, way far beyond the classroom. It is really about internalizing what not only diversity, equity, and inclusion are, but being completely consciously and fully aware with our eyes open that we might be reproducing unintentionally some of the oppressive structures and ways of this power over model when we are engaging or using language that is contrary to what DEI really is. So I tell folks that if you want to do social justice work or social change work, what have you done within yourself to clear out your own house, and to really look at what you're unearthing before you say that you're going to be doing this work with other people? Like clean your house up first before you go out and try to do DEI work. And DEI work, I would argue is it's not just out here, it's within. And so we have to be doing both simultaneously, and and before we go out and do work, and I write about this too a little bit, we don't do work on others. We don't do work that is about others. We should be working alongside each other and really interrogating, being okay to create spaces where we're interrogating these oppressive practices that may be unconscious, and finding ways to unearth them to make them more conscious so that we can take action to deal with them, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I was muted because of dogs. You called it humbling, and I definitely can see that, because I feel like a lot of times as a student, I look to my professors as they know everything, they've arrived, And I really appreciate when professors take a vulnerable stance and kind of model for me their process of continuously engaging in that self-reflective work so that I know what that looks like. And, you know, even though I'm an adult, even though they're an adult, I really appreciate that modeling and that example that my professors set when they do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelley. And I'll just say that in my view, we never arrive. We are always working toward. And part of why we're always working toward is because we're operating, as Audre Lorde says, in the master's house, so to speak. And we can't use the same ways of being and the same tools that that the dominant culture has created to counter it. We have to actually, there has to be a process of dismantling, and part of that dismantling is internal, which is where the humility comes in. And I want to say one last thing about humility. You know, Paulo Freire once wrote that, or in an interview, he said that humility is revolutionary. And that really sits with me in this space with you right now, because I'm thinking about, until we really do that internal work and we recognize that we haven't arrived, we're always going to be moving toward, and we have to do the work to keep moving toward, to keep moving the dial. That is very humbling. You know, the work never ends.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're getting near the end. So I know you're part of the CEC's Division for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Exceptional Learners. So I was wondering how your work with DDEL has benefited your work, and what do you see as the role of organizations like DDEL and the Diversity Caucus in navigating the challenges in our work?
Thank you. First of all, I've been a member of DDEL. I want to say, I was trying to remember how many years, but over a couple decades. And I think about my trajectory through DDEL from the 1990s to now, and all of the ways that I've been involved with DDEL in different contexts, different settings. And the one thing that the Diversity Caucus, the TED Diversity Caucus and DDEL have in common, which I greatly appreciate, is the willingness to really push our discipline, to constantly be moving forward, to not get stuck in certain ways of viewing disability identity, I'll say. DDEL really has pushed to open up what it means to be a person in this world with a disability, and having disability be a part of human variance and a part of the cultural repertoires that individual brings to the table, which may be inclusive of race and language and other identity markers that, you know, enrich that person's life, right? And so a lot of the podcasts and the social media links that I receive, and the newsletters that come out, and all of the updates that are constantly being pushed out by both the caucus and by DDEL are really illuminating, and they provide information that deepens our understanding of how different identities, these intersectional identities, interact to create new ways of us really expanding our discipline and moving the work forward. In addition, the communities, the networks, and the communities of support that are formed through these organizations are amazing. And the people involved are some of my biggest teachers and folks that I just so enjoy talking to and being around, in terms of progressing how I'm thinking. And also there's, within these spaces, there's tensions that arise, but they're really, really good tensions, because they force us to really analyze and critique some of the ways that we can actually improve, different structures or systems that maybe aren't working anymore. What worked 10 years ago is not going to work now. And you provided an amazing example of during the pandemic having to teach by going into the home instead of the opposite, the student coming into the classroom virtually. You're pushing into the home. That has just incredible, there's incredible potential as much as there were challenges. And so these are spaces where those conversations can occur. And they're also very, I think, very safe places for us to have conversations and with like-minded people who are really doing the internal work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So.
Thank you. I know I joined not because I felt like I was an expert in any way, but really because I was so excited to learn from the other individuals involved. So I know that was my perspective was, okay, I mean, just in case my coursework doesn't touch upon everything I need to know, I know that there's going to be some wonderful humans that I can just soak up all that knowledge through what they share in their conversations. So
absolutely.
So last question, and you've dropped a lot of big names that I adore, but who are some up and coming scholars that you are reading, and what do you find most compelling about their scholarship?
Well, I focused on two, and okay. I don't know if they're necessarily up and coming, but maybe they are, and maybe in terms of our discipline they are. But the first is actually one of my dear friends, my brother, Dr. Darold H. He's at NAU, Northern Arizona University, and we were at the University of Arizona together. He self-identifies as a Hopi father scholar, and he's doing amazing work in special education and also integrating Indigenous epistemologies into how youth with disabilities, particularly Hopi youth and Dene youth, can be rooted in their own cultural understandings. He uses a Nahangvita model, which means stay strong, dig deep, or self-empowerment. And what that means for his community and how he's using this model is having talking about home as in, the home environment and the higher education or school as another home environment, a different kind of home, but ways that we can create, again, pipelines so that the transition, that there's congruence in the transition, that when youth arrive to higher ed institutions with all these identity markers, with intersectional identities, that they feel rooted not only within their own home, but at their new home. And what are those factors that need to be at that new home that are going to allow them to feel that they can be and share who they are in those academic and educational spaces. So I love what he's doing, and I completely applaud his work. The other person I want to highlight, she's not up and coming, but her work has not necessarily intersected with our special education discipline, but it's someone that if we're working with families, we definitely need to have Dr. Ann Ishimaru on our radar. And her work involves improving, focuses on educational leadership, but she talks about both formal and informal family community settings in order to create collaborative and equitable educational environments. Her work, when I read it, it just resonates with me because I see her work as a model for where I can go with family as faculty. She's working with, it would be like as if I took family as faculty, if I expanded it outside of a course and integrated it more broadly into a whole teacher ed program or into a larger community, which is exactly what I want to do. So I look at her work as a target, like a direction to go into, and for us to be thinking about and creating systemic infrastructures that are going to integrate families' epistemic wisdom and knowledge in ways that are really authentic and mutually respectful and benefiting to the family and to the school community or to the university community in partnership. And she really also interrogates kind of those power structures that emerge and are there when you're doing this kind of work. And so I really appreciate what she's doing. And lastly, just in general, the work that I'm trying to intentionally integrate into my work with families within a special ed context are those who are Indigenous scholars and other scholars who are doing decolonizing work. So I've been using actually and thinking about the work by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, the Maori scholar, Eve Tuck, who's also an Indigenous scholar in Canada, and work by Lee Patel and Dr. Lee Patel and Dr. Kakali Bhattacharya in her work on decolonizing. Thinking about ways that when we're thinking about that larger worldview, that dominant culture system that we're operating under, how we can begin really systemically interrogating the components of that structure that are dehumanizing and oppressive for so many BIPOC students and their families with and without disabilities. So I'm really thinking about that work overall. But the other work I'm very, very, that I love integrating into my coursework is Alice Wong's work. And a lot of people already have this book, but if you read the individual stories by individuals with disabilities, what you're going to really uncover is how important their voice is in reimagining how we are thinking about not only disability, but how education needs to bend to really meet the new ways of thinking about neurodivergency and disability in general. So I think it's really exciting work that Alice Wong is involved in. And I love her podcast. And I'm just really excited that we have such amazing scholars who are informing our field.
Oh, thank you for those recommendations. I'm glad she has a podcast because my poor bookshelf is about to collapse and there's a whole shelf of books I haven't even gotten to yet. So thank you for those recommendations. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and